Welcome, everybody. This is John with CPF. We will be starting here in about 7 minutes. And as usual, we encourage people to use the Q&A box for your questions. We will leave those questions open throughout the course of the presentation, so you can ask them anytime. You can also upvote and comment on a question that's being asked if you'd like to see that question addressed first. We have two guests today, moderator Annabelle, and also our speaker would be Chris, and we'll be introducing them here soon. Feel free to let us know if you have any issues with sound or the technology on Zoom. If you'd like to move over to Facebook or YouTube or even LinkedIn, you can move to those platforms to watch today's presentation and also return to those channels to watch the recording later. We look forward to starting here. We'll start here in about 6 minutes. Hey everyone, we're about 3 minutes from the start of the program. In the meantime, feel free to let us know where you're from in the chat box. We have about 200 people signed up today, so we want to be sure that we're able to address all your questions. For that reason, we ask that you use the Q&A box for any questions you have. You can thumbs up any question that you'd like to see addressed first. You can also comment on questions. And if you'd like to say anything else, feel free to use the chat box. Let us know where you're coming from. See a few people from San Francisco here. We have attendees from 26 states today, so all across the country and even internationally. Hi, Diana from Spokane and Nelson from Atlanta, Georgia. So welcome, everybody. Again, we only have so much time for questions today, so feel free to use that Q&A box as much as you'd like. We'll address any questions that come in through the Q&A box. We'll start here in about 2 minutes. As a reminder, the full session will be recorded. You can find the recording at YouTube, at youtube.com/calpreservation, or at facebook.ca preservation/videos. You can follow along there for future programs. This program is free and available to the public at no cost, thanks to your generous donations. So we ask if you're able to, please visit californiapreservation.org/donate and make a donation today to continue to support our programming. We have a great lineup for 2023, and welcome everybody to our first program of the year. So we'll start here in about 1 minute. Welcome everybody to today's program. Thank you for joining us today. We're really excited about the topic today. We will have an hour today from 12 to 1 p.m. My name is John Haber. I'm the Field Services Director for the California Preservation Foundation. Today's free program will be highlighting the architecture of suspense in San Francisco, and we will have time for questions at the end of the program, so feel free to use that Q&A box today for that. First, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Annabelle Enriquez. Annabelle is on the Board of Trustees for the California Preservation Foundation, and she's going to be helping me field questions today from our very special speaker, Christine Madrid French. And Annabelle will be introducing the topic and the speaker today, and I'll be sort of in the background keeping an eye out for your questions. So welcome, Annabelle.
Thank you, John. It's my pleasure to be part of this webinar in which Christine Madrid French, or Chris, discusses her book, The Architecture of Suspense, the Built World in the Films of Alfred Hitchcock, especially for me being a very big Alfred Hitchcock fan and also loving architecture. And today it's a particularly special treat as Chris has prepared an all-new San Francisco edition of her talk for this CPF webinar. So many of you who have attended CPF webinars before have already encountered Chris in her former role at CPF. But for those of you who are new to our webinar series, a very brief bio, as I know that Chris will touch upon her history and background a bit as she goes through her presentation. So Chris, or Christine Madrid French, is an architectural historian and is currently San Francisco Heritage's Director of Advocacy, Programs, and Communications, a role that involves the coordination of the organization's preservation goals through advocacy, research, education, communication, and outreach, a role that I know that she is excelling and will excel in. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Chris for her presentation.
Thank you, Annabelle, and thank you, John and California Preservation Foundation. We are back, everybody. I'm so excited to see my friends in the chat. I have a brand new presentation. It's so hot off the press that I just finished it about 5 minutes ago. So I'm going to get started on that so that we have plenty of time for some questions. What I wanted to do was I heard John, you said it was the first one for CPF for 2023, and it's mine too. So I hope I can remember all of the buttons I need to press appropriately. So it's about the architecture of suspense, and this is the special San Francisco edition. I wanted to put something new together for everybody, but I'll go over what the book is about real quick in case you are not familiar with it. And this is Hitchcock. He's so excited. I finally finished this book. It took about 6 years from the beginning of the idea to the completion of it, to in your hands. And you can get the book from Amazon or from the University of Virginia Press. Either one is great. Here's just a picture of what you might find in there. Some quotes from Truffaut, who was Hitchcock's biographer and also a director himself. And there's a fun little picture of Hitchcock reading a script in the backyard of his actual house in Bel Air, California. So what do I mean by the architecture of suspense? And you might see like this is Vertigo. So mostly I look at Hitchcock, but you can see this evident in other movies, which I'll touch on briefly. But what it is about buildings in the movies, here's also from Vertigo, that kill you, to put it straight. So a building in the movie that plays a character. So in these movies, and thanks for posting those links, Sean, in the chat. So in these movies, you'll find architecture plays something bigger than just a background piece. So what really started my study was the Bates Mansion in Psycho. And what I found fascinating as a historian, historic preservationist, is that everybody knew this house. And how was that? How do you, and it's a fake house, like it never existed. How do you craft a memory like that that's so persistent that everyone can recognize a piece of architecture like that? So, as Hitchcock says, you should have seen the blood. You know, what you do to create an architecture of suspense is you take a nice secretary like Marion Crane. She performed a minor crime, went on the run, ended up at a place like the Bates Motel. I hope you know the story because there's spoilers in here. She meets this nice old grandmother who lives in the big house on the hill. She decides, I'm going to go back and make up for this crime. I'm going to start fresh. But instead, she is murdered in the shower, the one place where you're supposed to feel the most safe. So when we go past that a little bit, you look at this architecture of suspense. So Hitchcock is setting you up the entire time and you don't even know it. So in these scenes from the movie, you can see where Marion Crane is entrapped in the architecture. And that's another aspect of architecture on film that I write about, which is the architecture of entrapment. And you can see it right here. So if you look up in the corner, Marion she's in the bathroom, right, where she's counting the money that she just stole. Before she escaped, she's trapped in this hotel room with her boyfriend, Sam, down below. She's like trapped in the real estate office. The scene with the policeman who pulls her over, she's again entrapped in the vehicle. All of this is leading you up to that moment in the shower when she is, trapped even by the director. Here's Alfred Hitchcock posing and doing the scene. And then at the end, she's trapped again in the very trunk of her car as Norman pushes her body into the swamp. So this idea of architecture of suspense, started in the 1930s. It's, really started with Hollywood. And it's even, if you look at literature, Edgar Allan Poe, who we'll touch on later as well, kind of has this idea of architecture as a character. But one of the first places that I've seen is in The Black Cat, 1934. Someone mentioned in the chat, there's a mid-century modern. This is the first time a modernist building is used as a villain's lair, or one of the first times. There's a couple. This is one of the best known. In The Black Cat, you have this big kind of modern structure on the hill, and our two most favorite movie villains of all time, Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, are in this movie. And look at this beautiful Art Deco. So Bela is no longer the vampire in the castle. Now he's very suave, and he's inside this Art Deco mansion. But what happened was that this architecture of suspense in the terms of the villain's lair was sort of left to the side after that. It was only after Alfred Hitchcock used this, the Van Damme house, a rendering of the Van Damme house. It is not real. When he used it in North by Northwest, it was so successful to put a suave villain inside a very suave house that everybody took off with it. And it's still, now it's a Hollywood trope. If you have a villain, he's just got to live in a modernist place. Here's Big Lebowski, Sheets Goldstein residence, which was built for a family and not a villain. And you see it even today. So most recently in Don't Worry, Darling, the Kaufman House from 1946, designed by Richard Neutra, was for the first time really shown on film. And of course, it played the villain's lair. It didn't play, the beautiful, happy house where we all, swim in the pool and have lovely barbecue. No, instead, it was exactly where the villainous man lives. And the house itself played a character even in that movie, because if you imagine the villain there living in something more modest, he wouldn't have that power. So what is this? It's the power of architecture in stories. This is from The Shining, and you can see this is obviously very suspenseful. And this has entered this public consciousness, this realm of consciousness, which goes way beyond what the story of a hotel might be. And this is a scene from Barbarian, which just came out in 2022, which was a little tiny, cute house in Detroit that hid a terrible secret in the basement. One of my favorite movies, of course. So I wanted to do this very special edition just for everybody who is watching today. So, and I know my dad is watching too, Hitchcock movies in California in particular, and then how that applies to preservation. All of this is based on the research that's in my book. So as you know, Hitchcock was British. He was born in England and he came to the United States, but I really think of him as a Californian now because he so embraced the landscape and the architecture of California. He did have a house for 34 years. He lived at an estate called Heart of the Mountain in the Santa Cruz Mountains. They had vineyards. On the left is a picture of his wife, Alma, pointing out their vineyards. And you can still go to the estate today. I haven't been, but they apparently have Pinot Noir grapes and they are selling wine if you're up in the area. So, and obviously then Hitchcock also lived in Hollywood. And he talked a lot about how he loved the United States and how, because there's so much scenery. And so you can see he used it in 1940. He used Point Lobos State Reserve in Rebecca, which is a great early movie of Hitchcock's. In Shadow of a Doubt, he filmed in Santa Rosa. This was 1943. Hitchcock actually preferred to use sound stages whenever possible because he really wanted to control the situation. And this one for Santa Rosa, he had to film almost the entire thing on site because of the restrictions that during World War II for filming. And interestingly, I found an article, he built this stage in the back on a sound stage, and it's made almost entirely of recycled material. So he was only allowed to spend $5,000. Can you imagine? So they had recycled nails. They pulled everything from the back lot. But it's a very interesting story. It was covered in Life, I believe it was Life magazine, like 10-page story of how he used everything recycled for this particular set. So, but Hitchcock loved San Francisco, and I just recently moved back to San Francisco. So that's where I'm broadcasting from. And he just loved San Francisco. And if you've seen Vertigo lately, you will know how much he indeed loved San Francisco. The entire movie basically is about architecture in my mind. So this is 1958, the movie came out. This particular scene is from Big Basin where they filmed. And it's hard to keep track, really, but I think he filmed like at 10 or 12 different places for that movie. So we're going to look at Vertigo more closely, which is celebrating its 65th anniversary this year. And then The Birds, one of my personal favorites, of course, which is celebrating its 50th, wait, did I say that right? The 60th anniversary this year. And who wouldn't want to visit this lovely schoolhouse? So let's start with Vertigo. Hitchcock, you'll see these landmarks over and over again in Vertigo, and always it's the scene in the terms of architecture suspense. It's the scene where something terrible happens, usually for Alfred Hitchcock at the Golden Gate Bridge. Madeline jumps in the water in I believe, a fake suicide to get Scotty to fall in love with her. Here's poor Scotty in his apartment building, which is in downtown San Francisco. They filmed at Mission Dolores, which is a landmark, a San Francisco landmark. Actually, the first San Francisco landmark ever designated, because I'm doing some research on that right now. And then here is Ernie's. So interestingly, Ernie's was a very famous restaurant at the time in San Francisco. And this interior is so accurate, you might be fooled into thinking that they shot on site. But instead, they brought everything down to Hollywood because what part of it was the cameras were so big in those days that they could not actually maneuver this huge equipment in a lot of these interiors. Though they did do it for the flower shop, apparently seen in Vertigo. But for this scene, he actually had the chefs even come down and prepare food for the actors who were filming so it would be more accurate. And they brought place settings. They did an exact reproduction of Ernie's for this movie, which is good because Ernie's is completely gone now. If you're a fan of Hitchcock, I'm going to be mentioning a couple of websites where I get my information. This is the Hitchcock Zone/wiki. You'll see the address at the bottom of that picture, and you can map out every single location that, or somebody did it already, every single location that he filmed at, and what does it look like today. So this is what Ernie's looks like today. Where that brings us then is how can we use this architecture on film in terms of historic preservation? Like what can we learn from it? This is a very popular topic. So John King just did a story and he featured my book in this story. We took a nice walk around San Francisco. It's about Hitchcock was a master of suspense and using San Francisco to set the architectural mood. So there's tours here. People still look for these buildings. I personally, of course, make pilgrimages to as many of these buildings as possible. Here's another view then. So if we're preservationists and we're looking at the architecture, KQED took some scenes out of Vertigo. And what is interesting is you can actually see the passage of time. So what might have been like a background for a Hitchcock movie or Streets of San Francisco or Bullet or any of those great movies that are filmed here, you can examine those films and find out how time progresses through the city, how the buildings change, how the city changes. So here's the past in Vertigo, which is up on top, and then the present, which is on the bottom. They do some comparisons, like this is the initial rooftop scene that we opened with Vertigo. And by the way, when you watch Hitchcock, almost every single movie of his 1950s period starts with placemaking. He shows you, where are you at? And he shows you where you're at by showing the buildings. And this is why the buildings become so important to the interpretation of any Hitchcock movie. And this is that same scene today. That's the Brocklebank. I think they call it the Brocklebank Hotel Bus Residences. And for you Hitchcock nerds, you've got to go back to this Hitchcock Zone wiki. They put everything frame by frame for our convenience. So there's 1,000 frames of Vertigo, frame 264. You will see a building that we're going to spend a little time with here, and it's called the McKittrick Hotel in Vertigo. It's actually a house. And what's interesting about this house is, I'll tell you some more about it. So it was owned by the Fortman family. It was built in 1879 by a man named John Conley. And it's right here on Gulf Street, where I'm on Gulf Street right now. And thanks for posting some things in the chat, everybody. And so this McKittrick Hotel was actually someone's house. It was for John Conley, 1879. And then in 1895, Henry Fortman bought it at foreclosure for $42,500. Can you imagine? that was probably actually expensive in 1895, and that was a foreclosure from the bank. He bought it. And this house, you know, had a beautiful history. Here's a surprise for her husband. Mrs. Fortman surprised her husband for his 41st birthday. They had a banquet at this beautiful mansion. They had a wedding. Their daughter got married at this beautiful house. So it was a real contributor to San Francisco and San Francisco's history. Here it is as it's starring in the movie Vertigo, very small part, but very critical to the story. And this is what it looked like after the filming. So when the production designers found this building, it had already been abandoned. And also this is in the Western edition of San Francisco. And I'm learning more about that period, but during that time, it was about redevelopment, urban redevelopment, and a huge number. I think it's 2,000 Victorian buildings and good portions of Japantown were completely destroyed for redevelopment. And this site was part of that. So this is what the building looked like. The production, it was already abandoned when the production designers found it for Vertigo. They shaped it up and they filmed there. And then eventually it burned. So here's kids set fire to San Francisco movie mansion. And so what's interesting too about these things is it wasn't known, it didn't say, you know, kids set fire to the Fortman mansion. It's to the movie mansion. So already just the mere presence of Hitchcock or Hollywood had restructured the narrative around this building, which I find so interesting. It says recently featured in the movie Vertigo, set afire by matches. Oh, here it says right there in the article, the building was condemned for the Western Addition redevelopment and was abandoned. There is actually another building that looks similar to this, still down in that area. Somehow it escaped being demolished. So the interior, I have to do a little bit more research. I just didn't have time to get this information to y'all yet, but this is the interior of the mansion as shown in Vertigo. And it's very similar to the actual interior of the mansion. And though Hitchcock did not like filming on site very often, I believe, and maybe people know that, I believe that they actually did film that interior inside the McKittrick mansion, which would be so important because what's interesting when you see a movie versus this photograph, you see people walking up and down the stairs. You see the building actually comes back to life. And I think that this is the interior of the Haas Lilienthal house where I work, which is on Franklin Street. These interiors, I think, inspired Hitchcock's people because guess what was coming up right after that was Psycho, which of course takes place in a Victorian mansion that terrorizes everybody. Psycho came out in 1960, and this is a drawing, an early production design drawing of the interior of Psycho. And the Vertigo came 2 years before this, and I really think that their experiences with Vertigo helped inform the way that they created the mansion for Psycho. So here's just a couple little more things from Vertigo. Here's Scotty. This is across the street from the McKittrick Hotel. He's looking. He's like, "Where is Madeline? You know, I need to find her. She's up in the hotel." He's standing in front of the St. Paul's German Evangelical Lutheran Church. And this is what the site looks like today. I just walked by there the other day. There's Gough Street sign. You can see that. Now, just keep an eye on the little building to the far left. It's on my screen away from Scotty, and you'll see it here in the Vertigo. So here's the little, you know, what is that? Like a 3-4 story little residential apartments, probably, and then a smaller building next to it. And then it's still there. But this is why I find so fascinating about watching these films over and over again, is I can just, you know, it's like a treasure hunt. So unfortunately, this church was also a victim of fire. In 1995, the church burned down. It was an empty lot for a very, very long time. And now it's part of, in San Francisco, there's the California housing element in San Francisco wants to build, I believe, 30,000 housing units in the next 10 years. And this would be part of it, right? I probably got those numbers wrong, so we can check the internet later. So this is, Madeline at the very end of Vertigo. She's in the hotel, and this is the big moment of Vertigo when all is revealed to us as the viewers. And here she is looking out of the Empire, the Hotel Empire. And on the right is what the Hotel Empire looks like today. This is one of the buildings that John King and I walked past. And interestingly, it is being converted into at least temporary housing. It was used as temporary housing for families, I believe, people during COVID. And then now I believe it's being turned into housing, temporary, possibly. And I had something else in there, but what I was thinking of is there's the slide might be in here later. If we get to it, we get to it. But there's some more history with the Hotel Empire. Okay, let's run off to the birds, because look at this. Who doesn't want to be running, screaming from a historic structure with being attacked by crows? And then, of course, a murder of crows is a collection of crows. Oh, here's Helen. Okay, this slide got in the wrong spot. This is what I was going to show you about the Hotel Empire. So at the Hotel Empire, interestingly, which Vertigo is all about falling to your death. And leaping. And right before they started filming Vertigo, at the Hotel Empire, a woman actually very sadly committed suicide. And it was covered very small in the newspaper, but here it is, death leaper, nearly hits woman on street. Helen Zerflo was actually an unemployed person. She worked at the department stores in San Francisco. They said that she just took her newspaper and walked to the roof. And you can see on the left-hand side how they depicted for poor Helen. But what was interesting is this happened right before they started filming Vertigo. So I call this the mystical Alfred Hitchcock. When you start doing research into his movies, strange things happened either before or after or during the filming. So the fact that a woman fell from the roof or at the very place for the movie where people fall from roofs, to me, I found that very coincidental. Also, Helen was unemployed, a department store shopkeeper, as you know, and that's what Judy was as well. Judy talks about in the movie Vertigo that she worked at iMagnin and she lived at the Hotel Empire. Just an interesting coincidence. Back to the birds. So if you didn't know, Alfred Hitchcock was inspired by Daphne du Maurier's book, The Birds, but also an actual event that happened in Santa Cruz. Now, we already told you he had a house out there, right? And here's the story. It said Alfred Hitchcock, using the Sentinel seabird story, that he was inspired by an actual event with thousands of birds were floundering in the street. So where he used that event, both the fictional story and a real event that inspired him. Look at this picture of the policeman with the bird on top. That looks so much like what Hitchcock depicted later in the actual movie of the birds. Okay, so here is another picture of that, birds just around, and here's Hitchcock. He's like, he gets inspiration from every place. So this is Brad, a deputy sheriff, tries to figure out the mystery of the seabird invasion early this morning along East Cliff Drive. It says many of them crashed into houses, and some went back to the sea. Some flew away. They all seemed helpless, according to the newspaper. So much like in the movie The Birds. So if you open the birds, here we go again. Hitchcock puts you, there's a real sense of placemaking in Hitchcock's movies. This is almost the very first scene of the birds. And you can see Tippi Hedren is down there by the walk sign. What's so great is you can see Union Square in San Francisco as it appeared in about 1963 with people walking in action. And there goes the cable car. And then if you didn't know this was San Francisco, just from those clues, Hitchcock very helpfully shows Tippi Hedren up here in the right-hand side. She walks past the sign that says San Francisco right past the newsstand. Hitchcock used that moment to kind of do a little tricky thing. So you'll see her in person walking across the crosswalk at Union Square. She passes the sign of San Francisco. When she emerges on the other side, she's on the Hollywood set, which is Davidson's pet shop. So it's very tricky little editing they use there to take you from the real site to the fake site. And then that's when Hitchcock makes his standard cameo appearance. He pops out from the pet store with his 2 dogs. So one of the real stars of the Birds is the schoolhouse. It's in Bodega, and not necessarily Bodega Bay, though it's, it's Hollywood. They say whatever they want. But it's actually in Bodega. It's the Potter School building. It was built in 1873. It was sold in December 1961. It was condemned and then sold at auction. And that's when it was abandoned, when Robert Boyle, production designer for the Birds, found it. I don't know what era this picture is. It looks like something from the 80s, but so they used this building in the Birds in 1962. They seem to really like to get these abandoned houses and then put them in the movies. So it was going to be torn down, but the movie was so popular, it actually saved this building. In June 1966, it was bought by Tom and Mary Taylor, and they restored it. And their family, 3rd generation of their family, still lives in the Bodega Bay, what we call the Bodega Bay Schoolhouse, which is actually the Potter School building today. So the building was actually saved in part from Hitchcock's movie. Now you can, I just love the internet. I love this, where you can ask your kids to run screaming and recreate the scene from the Birds, and then Photoshop all your favorite avian friends in there. So I'll start wrapping up. So I want plenty of time for Q&A. So in the book, you'll see other movies, some of our favorites, North by Northwest, which features the United Nations as a site for murder, of course. Mount Rushmore, where's another site where you might get murdered. This is very much a Hitchcock kind of thing. And then in the book, I have found some interesting things that I've revealed to you. So this is a picture of Alfred Hitchcock in Life magazine, is in a 1-page promo for Psycho. So in doing this research, I went through every single reference for Alfred Hitchcock in Life magazine. And I think like 3,500 images in the Getty archive, because I wanted to find something different. And indeed I did. So this is a little picture of Alfred Hitchcock in Life magazine. Nobody paid attention to this, but it was by Gordon Parks. Very unusual. I really loved it. So I asked the archive for a copy of it. They said, we don't have that, but we have the picture that was behind the process plate. So this is a picture of Alfred Hitchcock that's never been published before, and is taken by noted African-American photographer, Gordon Parks, who actually was a director as well. He was the director of Shaft, and a very famous photographer, noted for his many of his works, including works of people living in New York and other cities, urban works. Very unusual photograph of Hitchcock. Yes, he's like without shirt, but apparently in the 12 Lives of Alfred Hitchcock, he was very cheeky, and he would do jokes, and he would take his shirt off at dinner time and wiggle around. Not anything I'd want to see, but nonetheless, also in my book, there's a list of 50 movies to watch in which the architecture is the celebrity. So you might want to check that out. I'm working on my next project is going to be a historical fiction mystery with Edgar Allan Poe at the University of Virginia. And if you know, Edgar Allan Poe went to UVA, which is where I graduated, and also the publisher of my book, of The Architecture of Suspense. But Edgar Allan Poe was only 17 when he attended UVA. He was there, I believe, from February to December 1826. And right across the street from him, they were building the Anatomical Theater. I mean, come on. Anyway, so this is going to be my next book. I just started it. It should be out in about 3 years, I'm hoping. And I just wanted to pitch a little bit where I work right now, San Francisco Heritage. There's our address, sfheritage.org. We are headquartered in the Haas Lilienthal Mansion on Franklin Street. We have a couple of very important things coming up. And if you are interested and you're in San Francisco, one of the issues we're working on is the Castro Theater, which is undergoing some changes. And what we're lobbying for is interior landmarking of this very important theater. As you know, a theater is so, the inside is as critical as the outside for a movie theater. So what we're looking at is there's a town hall, which I will be speaking at on January 26th at 7:30. And there's a very important Historic Preservation Commission meeting on February 1st, starts at 12:30. I will be there as well. And that is when the actual interior landmarking nomination is going to be approved. And we are encouraging everybody who does show up to wear red, which is the same color as the Castro seats. And just if you were interested in more of my work, it's madridfrench.com. My article in Vanity Fair came out in October, and I created, my friend Frederick Taylor, who is with Toronto Pictures, created a little sizzle reel so you can see me actually murdering myself in the shower, which is all fun. And then the big moment, February 20th of this year, I will be at Modernism Week with even more all new material. It'll be at the Annenberg Theater, and I hope everyone can make it because Modernism Week is so much fun for everybody. And I just wanted to, I want to see everybody there. It's going to be a lot of fun. And don't forget to get the book. It's on Amazon. Thank you so much. All right, Annabelle.
Thank you, Chris. That was great. It definitely added, to me at least, more dimension to the book, which again, I encourage everyone here to pick up and read, because there's a lot more exploration of some of the things that Chris has just barely delved into during this presentation. So thank you, Chris. And
Sure.
I see that we already have some questions here. So in our and as a reminder, if you do have a question, please do enter it in the Q&A panel. And yeah, and then also too, if you don't have a question, but you see questions that you are also interested in, do go ahead and upvote those questions so that so that we know which ones we should prioritize. So the first one asked by Reem Cam. Hi, Christine, loved reading your book. My question is, you wrote about pairing the buildings with an emotional response as an approach for discovering and interpreting American architecture. Can you speak more about that, please? Thank you.
Of course. So the emotional response, I think what's key is the way that Hitchcock takes a building, and other movie makers as well, and they put you in a space. So let's just take Marion being murdered in the shower at the Bates Motel. You are just not going to forget that. And so forever after, if my mother went and saw Cycle in the theater, and I asked people this who've seen it in the theater, and people actually stopped showering for months at a time. This scene was so incredibly jolting that a place where you feel safe. And ever after that, the little motel was associated with murder in the public mind. So if you take sort of a very pivotal event and you pair it with the building, suddenly the building's narrative actually changes. And it could be a singular structure with an event that, there's plenty of events we could talk about, but try to think of a happy event, but I can't really think of any. Mostly the events that I study are traumatic events. So, it'd be where somebody was killed or something. And you notice that the building, you could say with a warehouse for the Kennedy assassination, for instance, that building is only known for that one event at this point, right? So there's something about pairing a structure with some kind of emotional experience that really sticks. Well, you can even think, if you want to think of some happy stuff, you can think where did you get married, right? So you always think of that building with the happy thought, or maybe where did your kids go to elementary school, things like that. But you always put the building then. There's something that locks it in, I think, into the human memory, because now there's a story around it. It's no longer just a building. And so when I'm doing historic preservation too, I do rely on nostalgia as part of my historic preservation argument. As a historian, they would always say, oh, we can't talk about nostalgia. That's not scientific. I'm but it's meaningful. It's very meaningful. And so if that building is important to me because something important to me happened there, then that building is significant to that person. So that's how I think the things go together.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Another question that's been upvoted. Wonderful lecture. Does the book explore how the architecture creates suspense? For example, the shape of the space, the scale, etc.
Okay, definitely. So I talked about, and if Alan Hess is here, Alan wrote the foreword to my book. I just wanted to mention that. And I've been sharing with Alan some of the work I'm doing on the architecture of entrapment in anime. So I've been studying Japanese anime works and how this idea of entrapment from Hitchcock might also work in other storytelling types. And that's where I stumbled across a brand new thing. And if you might be familiar with the concept called the uncanny valley. So the uncanny valley was developed by a Japanese roboticist, and he found out that there's like a graph that you could make. The valley would be the bottom of this graph, that as something approaches more human features in robotics, there's a moment when it's hasn't quite gotten there, and people feel very uncomfortable with that representation, and then it's all the way humanoid, and suddenly it's accepted. So that uncanny valley is where something looks like something you're familiar with, but something's wrong with it. And there's just been a study, just came out, scientific study on uncanny valley in architecture. And then I suddenly realized that's what we're looking at. So if you're talking about which hallways, is that what the question was too, like hallways, stairways, places like that. What I realized is that it's what they do in film is they take something that is familiar to you, like the white bathroom at the Bates Motel, and there's something wrong with it. And you're not quite sure, you can't put a finger on it, but it makes you uncomfortable when you look at it. So they did that a lot in Barbarian, where they showed like the steps to the basement. You're like, well, it looks like a regular basement, but they put something in there. It's uncanny. So it's uncanny architecture, I think, is what creates this suspense.
Great. And that question was asked by Caitlin Kazoyan. Thank you. Next question asked by Lindsay Tran. Hi, Chris. Did you come across any links between Hitchcock and Shirley Jackson in your research? Any parallels in their work?
Well, I think he must have been inspired. So Shirley Jackson is the author who wrote The Haunting of Hill House. I always get the names mixed up because there's another one that's similar names. Anyway, she wrote a story about a big haunted mansion, and her grandfather was actually an architect in San Francisco, and she lived in San Francisco, and she says that she was inspired by the mansions of San Francisco when she wrote that. I didn't see anything that said Hitchcock says, yes, I love Shirley Jackson's writing. But for sure, it came out at the exact same time as Psycho, basically. It was 1959 is when her book came out. In 1959, I believe, is when the novel Psycho came out. The movie came out in 1960. So people were really thinking, for me, I'm like, what is it with the Victorian mansion all of a sudden? It's like, it's haunted, you're going to get killed in there. So I did some more research. Why do people associate Victorian mansions with horror? Right? Why are people scared of these mansions when they're intended to be very modern places for families to live at one point when they were built? And I've pinned a lot of it down again to the sort of uncanny idea that starting in like the 30s, but definitely in the 70s, 60s, 70s, these buildings were not in good condition, like the building of the McKittrick Hotel. They looked scary. The windows were blown out, weird insides, kind of funky, scary. And then they started to demolish these buildings everywhere. So Los Angeles had its own sort of Western Addition type demolition program, which was on Bunker Hill. It was filled with Victorian mansions, beautiful Victorian mansions. In a very highly publicized effort, they basically tore everything down and moved other things off site. And if you don't know where Bunker Hill is, you see you see the Gary's new Disney Hall is on Bunker Hill. So that's where the mansions used to be. And I think that the public was just mistrustful of this building type. And then all of a sudden you see it pops up everywhere. The Addams family has it's all about a Victorian mansion that people are scared of. So Charles Addams, I did see a lot of references to Charles Addams with Hitchcock stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, so that ties into the question I'm going to ask now from James Papp. So welcome back, Christine.
Hey, James.
Grant Wood in Gothic Revival, Charles Adam in Second Empire, Hitchcock in Italianate. Are these the first ones who equated Victorian architecture to creepy?
Okay, yes, I am trying to get to the bottom of this one, James, because Victorian buildings have not been around that long. So what used to scare us before Victorian buildings? So how did this suddenly translate? I think Edgar Allan Poe really started a lot of this. He was pre-Victorian, but he did the Fall of the House of Usher. And I think it started with kind of like the manor house, and then it just turned into the Victorian. And still you'll see like maybe British stories pre-Victorian, it would be just a big castle. It's kind of like same thing with The Shining. Like, when did hotels get so creepy? Because at one point there were no hotels, right? There were lodging houses and rooming houses. There wasn't a hotel. And now the hotel is just synonymous, like you're going to be scared, you go in there. So how did that happen? That's what I find so compelling, and I keep investigating. But there is a definite connection. If I show someone a Second Empire Victorian house with mansard roof, they immediately say, oh, it looks like Psycho, right? Or if you look at Amityville Horror from the 70s, it has like a Dutch gambrel roof with these kind of, semicircular lunettes on one end. I heard that you can't hardly buy a Dutch gambrel roof house anymore because no one wants to repurchase it, because they'll go and say Amityville Horror. And that's like from the 1970s horror story and a movie, and it was huge in that period. I think eventually, as the public memory fades, that won't happen. The power of that memory is incredible. The 70s were a long time ago, and people still think of it.
Would you say
Right.
the same about modernism and being associated with the villain's lair? You've talked a lot in the past about North by Northwest and the Van Damme house and everything. Do you think the public perception of modernism has changed because of some of these depictions in films?
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, modernists are funny. So the modern houses, you can't really see them as a member of the public. If you don't know somebody, they're not very open, right? So if you go to one of these like really big modernists, like a Lautner house, it's like a very mysterious thing behind the bushes. You can't see anything. And so I think that continues, that people still think it's very villainous. And I think that a lot of that is the memory of James Bond. So the early James Bond movies, Hitchcock introduced modernism as the villain's lair in North by Northwest. And then boom, Ken Adams was production designer, Ken Adam, and he picked up on it for James Bond series. And then it was just locked in. And then everybody said, we're doing it. And so even the vampires in Twilight live in the Arthur Erickson house, which is crazy. It's all glass. When did a vampire want to live in an all glass house? Eventually that could fade, but what else would you replace it with? So if the Hollywood people could think of something that's more villainous, maybe postmodern. So it has to be something that is like removed from the public experience. And that's what creates the best villain's lair. It's not something that you're ever really allowed to go in.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point. And as I was reading your book, I thought it's so unfair that a certain architectural style gets kind of an association with a place you get killed with, or just with villainy. But
Someone put like brutalism. Brutalism had its moment, So I think it's called High Rise. It's on my movie list, and it's a brutalist building. But I think for brutalism, in a way, the period was so short. Same with postmodernism. The actual period was so short. Wow, we got a lot of cute questions in there. Yeah. Anyway, so continue.
Oh, absolutely. So there are two questions that I'm going to pair up because they have to do with music. First one is by Ted Talley. Can you comment on how or if the Bernard Herrmann score supported not only the characters and storylines, but may have been ancillary supports to the buildings and filming sites? And then to add to that, from question by Ward, I think the visual and Bernard Herrmann's music are so important in many of the scenes, Vertigo and Psycho, the screeching violins in the shower. Have you thought about architecture and music in his films?
Yes. Okay, so for the people who asked that question and anybody else who's interested, here's a fun thing that you can do, a fun thing for me at least. What you do is you take the soundtrack of Vertigo and you actually walk around San Francisco and you play Bernard Herrmann's music while you're walking in the buildings. One time I was in a hurry to get to LAX and I'm in the rental car and I played the soundtrack from Psycho as she's leaving, as Marion Crane is driving away. And there's something that is so intense when you do that. Once I drove through a cemetery and I played the song from the Haunted Mansion, for instance, and you can manufacture in your own mind the music is so incredibly important. And then I guess this is a good time to mention that people like to ascribe all of everything to, Hitchcock, same as like Neutra did everything or Frank Lloyd Wright did everything. It's the same thing we do with architects. Obviously, Hitchcock had hundreds and hundreds of people helping him create these movies. And I think the ones that are most penetrating for me, which would be those 1950s and 60s ones, he had an incredibly talented team put together, which included Bernard Herrmann, which included editors, cinematographers, production designers like Robert Boyle. And there's something for real magical about the way that all of that came together. And it's so powerful. That's why we're still celebrating like the 65th anniversary of Vertigo this year, the 60th anniversary of the Birds, because what those things put together created such a magnificent story. So Bernard Herrmann, a friend of mine, put Bernard Herrmann's music from North by Northwest to some of the scenes of Nope, which is by Jordan Peele, where the alien is coming down. And Bernard Herrmann's music is absolutely fantastic. You can use it for a lot of things. So it's very critical to understanding the architecture.
Right. Let's see. Okay, there's a question here about San Francisco churches. Is there a trend as, this is asked by L. Kimmelman. So in San Francisco, is there a trend, as in other cities, of converting former churches into condos and other types of secular buildings?
Is there a trend for converting churches into secular buildings?
Such as condos, yes.
Churches are complicated because I remember a trip I took to St. Louis, and there were so many congregations cannot maintain the churches. And in fact, right next to me is a congregation in a big Gothic style church, and the congregations diminish. So the congregation needs to move out of town. Actually, they cannot afford to maintain the building. So this is one of the issues with big historic structures. So to have them converted into housing or something, I wouldn't be necessarily opposed to it. What's important is to maintain, I think, obviously the exterior, and also whatever interior elements really make the building the building that it is. So I definitely am a believer that sometimes interior needs to be kept. I know when a church is sanctified, I don't know what the term is, but they will remove they'll even remove some of the stained glass windows and things like that as part of that, creating it to put back a structure. But I always think it's better than losing the building entirely. So adaptation can be good. Consecrated, thank you. Somebody put that in the chat. I'm trying to peek at the chat every once in a while.
So the next question, Nelson Bracken Jr. asks, are the 50 films you mentioned as being listed in your book by other film directors than Hitchcock? Okay, so by other film directors than Hitchcock. When I worked with Bruce Goff, we would watch films that featured interesting architecture, such as Fu Manchu, that featured the work of Gaudi. Well, maybe you can discuss that, the 50 films you mentioned as being listed in your book by other directors than Hitchcock. It was a very interesting list.
Again, it's like my mind on paper. So warning, Nelson, it's so good to hear from you again. So Nelson and I had coffee in Atlanta one time. We had a very interesting talk. So I'm just thinking right here in my book, 50 films to watch. So what I did was try to pick out movies that I have watched repeatedly, because as you can imagine, I watch tons of movies, and then movies where the architecture is just going to hit you right in the boom. So the first thing is Alien, of course, by Ridley Scott. So, if you're in the spaceship Nostromo, come on, that is architecture of entrapment. Those people cannot get away. And what Alien does is Ridley Scott takes you all the way back to the beginning of Western storytelling of buildings, which is the labyrinth. And so I do a lot of research on labyrinths and what it really means. And that is, behind The Shining. The Shining is basically the story of the labyrinth retold. There's a monster, which is Jack Torrance himself, running around these maze-like spaces, which in fact they included the maze. So that is very much labyrinthine. And then I have in here like The Black Cat, Blade Runner, obviously, Body Double, which features a Lautner structure It's the one on the hill. And Annabelle, you can remind me because I forget the name of it, even though I know this building. It's like, it's like standing on a toothpick.
I mean the chemosphere?
Yes, thank you. The chemosphere is in Body Double, of course, where there's a murder, and it's an homage to Rear Window. The Others is a great movie about an old mansion where some people live and maybe some ghosts. Then I also include movies like I really watch. I watch some Indonesian horror, Spanish horror, and Korean horror. There's some in here that are Indonesian movies, Spanish movies, and other that kind of take the same idea. Wreck is a Spanish movie, very scary, occurs like in a big kind of a apartment house that is closed down and the people are trapped inside. So, and Evil Dead, Dracula, stuff like that. It's a really fun list. So if you need something to do, you could definitely go through that list, take a while.
All right, next question by Stephen Montgomery. Was the Bates Motel a set?
Yes, okay, Bates Motel is a set, but also in the book, I found and I put it in here because I wanted to kind of make a treasure hunt for people. I think it's appendix 1 or 2 or 3. I found in the records for Psycho at the Margaret Herrick Library, and just an aside, I actually had seen Hitchcock's own shooting script for Psycho. But inside there as well is a list. Here it is. The motels were listed in research notes that the production team went and visited in California in preparation for doing this Bates Motel. And there's a whole list of them in Redding, where would you go? Red Bluff and Fairfield. And then I did locate one which was the most looking like it. But yes, the Bates Motel and the mansion, both are completely fabricated, totally studio.
Yeah, so we have, I don't think I see a lot of questions, but some comments. So I can, maybe some of these will spur some conversation here. Comment by Chuck Kaminsky. I find Hitchcock's individual buildings and cityscapes key characters as mystery and suspense, just as Jacques Tati's films portray urban and corporate modern life as almost dystopian. And yeah, so that's a comment there. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I would.
Oh yeah, I'm reading these comments. Excellent work, people. So the dystopian. Dystopian landscape. So that's what I found a lot of in anime. So in anime, a lot of the animators would use the anime that I watch, which is always the dystopian anime. A lot of people would use the Kowloon Walled City in Hong Kong as a setting, and they would use these the streets of it, and it was very dystopian, very crowded. It's one of the most dense places on earth. It's been demolished since then. Corporate, modern. Of course, because none of us really wants to be stuck in a skyscraper. Louis Sullivan talked about that, the honeycomb, where you just pile up people one on top of the other, And so all of us, I think, have a little bit of fear of the corporate skyscraper. Plus, it's so they shade you and they shadow you and they loom over you when you're walking down the street. So I see a comment in here about the Cecil Hotel. Scary. I love researching the Cecil Hotel. I'm not sure what's up with it right now. But that's the thing about hotels I should mention that a lot of people don't know, maybe, is that hotels are a place where a lot of stuff happens, and not just the things you're thinking. Like resort hotels in particular, there are quite a few deaths because people will go to a resort hotel at the end of their lives to, spend their last weekend, etc. And they don't make it. So hotels actually are kind of scary. There's a lot happening inside those hallways. A Queen Anne Victorian in a movie, yes, for sure. I just watched one the other day from the 80s. It's just the fact that it's a Victorian. There's something, I think, intimidating about going up to the door of a big Victorian mansion. And even at the house where I work right now, it's intimidating. You got to walk all the way up, and the house is just like, it's enormous. And you got to be pretty brave, and you're not really sure what's behind the door. So here we have the Mark Hopkins, Frank Lloyd Wright. Oh, okay, yes, the Frank Lloyd Wright Ennis house is in Blade Runner. It's always a bad guy who's living in there. That's interesting. Yes, sometimes cars could also be associated with bad guys. But all of this is all very Hollywood. Hollywood is going to use something that's easy for people to interpret, worldwide. And I think that's important. What Hitchcock latched onto is that people were scared of skyscrapers around the world, right? And you wouldn't have like maybe a Victorian mansion in some other part of the world, but there's something about it that just triggers something that you're scared of. So even if you're not familiar with the architecture, you are familiar with scary dark spaces, you know, and hallways that are a little too small. Oh, I know. I just went to Winchester Mansion this weekend, and that place is amazing. What I noticed is that I've been going there since the 70s. And what I noticed is that the narrative of the building changes over time. And so when I went in the 70s, the private owner was always, you know, so spooky, and the lady would have seances and just all ghosts and everything in there. And they still have that. But now there's a new narrative running alongside it, which is that she was a lady who really liked architecture, and she just liked to add to this building a lot. Very unusual structure. I would encourage everyone to visit that. That has everything that I talk about all in one big building. We got speaking tubes, we have, you know, seance rooms, we have multiple kitchens, we have indoors, outdoors, all mixed together, stairways going to nowhere, doors that open into nothingness. So that's a really fun place. Oh, wait, I see somebody's doing Christine. I just watched that. Sorry, I'm talking so fast, Annabelle, but I know we're running out of time. So, so Christine is a great one. John Carpenter, it's about a car, right? A car that's a demonic car, based on a story by Stephen King. But they're using the same kind of thing in that movie that we talk about with Alfred Hitchcock in Psycho. So now when people see, I believe it's a 58 Plymouth, they say, oh my gosh, it's Christine. They don't say, look at that great 58 Plymouth, this red 58 Plymouth. They say, it's Christine. Like the identity has so penetrated culture. It's just always fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm. So some questions here at the top that have been upvoted, and this is maybe, you know, something to end on perhaps. Apologize if this question was already answered, but what is Christine's favorite building in a Hitchcock film and why?
Oh, well, it's obviously the Bates Mansion. The reason I am so fascinated with it is it scares me every time I watch it. And I just am very interested. The Bates Mansion has been reinterpreted by generations of people at this point, and it has this incredible power, narrative architectural power over the public still. And it would never truly existed. That is what I find fascinating. It's not like maybe Golden Gate Bridge where Hitchcock filmed under the bridge. It still exists. You could go visit it, or the Hotel Empire. This is a building that never existed, completely fabricated and so powerful. And that's what I find most compelling. There's so many other questions. If anyone wants to, I have on my website, it's madridfrench.com. There's a box where you can put your name and your email and your questions. If you want to ask me any more questions, you could go to my website and just go ahead and post stuff in there, and then I can answer your questions.
Okay, well, thank you both so much for this wonderful, insightful hour. I wish we could go on for more. I wanted to remind people that I pasted into the chat box a link to leave feedback, and I'll share that with Chris. So if you do have questions, you can always share your email in that, and I'm sure she'll get back to you. And also remind you that our conference is coming up soon in April 16th, 17th through the 20th of 2023. And Chris is on our program committee, so she'll be involved in it. And we're really excited to open up registration this week. So this week we should, if you check out our website, you should be able to register for the conference. With that being said, we're going to close out here. Recordings will be available on our YouTube channel and our Facebook channel. Feel free to go back to those to see all of our past programs. And Chris, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be working with you again, even if just for an hour.
So back to be with the team again. So good to be back with the team. So thank you, John and Annabelle and California Preservation Foundation for this opportunity.
Thank you, Chris.
Bye.